Good evening. My name is Onika Williams, and I'm chair of the National Bar Association Young Lawyers Division. Thank you for joining us tonight for Black Lives and Racial Equity. This timely discussion, led by our very own social justice co-chair, Temi Bennett, will address several issues, including how do we achieve racial equity, what are some best practices, and how does racial equity work differ from diversity and inclusion work. First, just a little bit about the NBA and the NBA YLD. The National Bar Association was founded in 1925 and is the nation's oldest and largest national network of predominantly African-American attorneys and judges. The YLD is the home of the young lawyer within the NBA and represents the interests of young Black attorneys under the age of 40 years old or originally admitted to practice within the past 10 years, whichever is more inclusive. This year's NBA YLD theme, 2020 and Beyond, recognizing the importance of the young lawyer, has been seen throughout 7 programmatic areas. 1, election protection, voter registration, and education. 2, COVID-19 recovery efforts. 3, efforts to eliminate police brutality. 4, 2020 census efforts and 2021 redistricting efforts. 5, professional and skills development. 6, mental health and wellness. And 7, pipeline programs and mentorship opportunities. Tonight's program is the first of a series of Black Lives Learning Lab events that will be led by Temi Bennett throughout the remainder of the 2020-2021 bar year. Chicago native Temi F. Bennett is currently the Director of Policy and Communication at Consumer Health Foundation. She is responsible for engaging local governments in the DC metropolitan region in approaches to developing and implementing racially equitable policies and systems change that enable communities of color to thrive. Temi is very involved in the DC community, including co-chairing Resourcing Radical Justice, a new funders collective that centers Black liberation as the path to thriving Greater Washington area. Since March 2020, RRJ has been coordinating sustained funding and COVID-19 rapid response funding to organizations led by people of color with budgets less than $1 million that are working at the grassroots level to drive systematic change. Temi received her JD from Georgetown University Law Center, where she served as editor-in-chief of the Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. She graduated magna cum laude from Virginia State University with a BA in English. Temi has a passion for international travel, sci-fi fantasy novels, Japanese manga, and Korean dramas. And now to Temi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm going to try to start my PowerPoint presentation now, and hopefully the technology gods are with me this evening. Okay. Actually, you know what? Let me do that one more time because I think it's something, if I want to play a video, which I do later, I want to make sure you guys have the sound. Okay, let's try one more time. So, good evening, everybody. While my focus is on Black folks in the United States, on my presentation today, I want to acknowledge that I sit on the ancestral lands of the Nacogdoches, also known as the Anacostia, Pamunkeys, and the Piscataways, who were subjected to attempted genocide and oppression. The objective of tonight's presentation is to increase knowledge and understanding of racial equity as both a goal and a process. First, let's talk about race. To begin, it's important to have shared language around race, both race and racism. Race is a social political construct used to confer advantage and disadvantage based on the false belief in hierarchy of human value. Groups in the United States get racialized based on color, ethnicity, culture, language, religion, and various other distinctions. In terms of biology, race is not real. Humans are 99.9% alike, and there is more genetic variation within races than across race. But the idea of race, as it has been constructed both socially and politically, are real, and it shapes the life outcomes of all those who live in this country. Racism is a system of structuring opportunities and assigning value based on social interpretation of how we look. There are various types of racism. Today, I'm gonna define 3. Interpersonal racism is bigotry or discrimination by an individual based on race. Institutional racism is policies, practices, and procedures within our societal institutions that work better for white people than for people of the global majority, whether intentionally or inadvertently. Structural racism is the history and ongoing reality of prejudice and discrimination across all institutions, cultural norms, interpersonal interactions, dominant narratives, and that combines to create a system that subjugates and exploits BIPOC people in their communities. By BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, people of color. And BIPOC is a term that is prioritizing the marginalizations of communities. That's why it leads with Black, then Indigenous, and then people of color. Once these structures are in place, no one has to actively think about race, privilege, or discrimination for these systems to disadvantage BIPOC populations. This is really important because oftentimes people think of racism or systemic racism as intentional. And what we know is that because the way that the system works, it doesn't matter that your intention was to harm, if your intention was to not harm Black and brown folks, what we know is that if you don't have some kind of racial equity intervention, then that your decision or policy or whatever it is that you're looking at will harm Black and brown folks or will work to the advantage of white folks. I like to use Racial Equity Institute's Groundwater Approach analogy to understanding systemic structures and institutions. I think this is really important because a lot of times people try to blame systemic racism on culture or behavior or even on individuals. And so I want you to imagine that you own a property and on your property you have multiple lakes. And you're out rowing on one of your lakes one day and you notice that a bluefish is floating belly up dead. What do? It makes sense to analyze the fish, right? What's wrong with it? Did it eat something bad? Was it sick? The next day you go rowing and you notice that all the bluefish are floating belly up dead in that lake. Now it makes sense to analyze the lake water, not the fish. Why are all the bluefish dead and is the water contaminated? The next day you come out and you're rowing and you look at all your lakes on the property. And in every single lake on your property, the bluefish are belly up dead. So this isn't about the individual bluefish. This isn't even about one of your lakes. This is about all of your lakes. And you can compare, I'm using the analogy of lakes as a example of systems, right? And so if you're looking at, I can take one lake and it could be our prison system. I can take another lake and it could be our education system. I can take another lake and it can be our food system. I can take another lake and it could be our healthcare system. And so if all the bluefish are in every single lake floating up belly dead, then it's not about the lakes, it's not about the individuals, it's not about the one system, it's about the groundwater, right? Like the lake, the property are all sitting on the groundwater. And so that is what structural racism is. It's a groundwater problem, right? And so even if we treat one bluefish, right? Like maybe we take the bluefish out, we give it some antibiotics and we fix it, but then we're putting that fish back in toxic water. And so if that fish doesn't do well, what we tend to do as a society and culture is say, well, it's the bluefish's fault, right? Like what behavior, what cultural issues are going on with this bluefish that makes it not survive or thrive the way that these other fishes are surviving and thriving. That is why structural racism is so pervasive. Is because people like to think of it as individual acts or intentions, but it's in the air, it's everywhere, and everybody is breathing this toxic air. It's in our groundwater, and we need groundwater solutions. We don't need programs, we need policy change. Okay, moving on. What we know when you look at history is that institutional and structural racism adapts. And so, it started 1619, even before this country was a country, when our first enslaved Africans came here. And then after the abolition of slavery, we had Jim Crow and convict leasing. And then after that period, you know, after the civil rights movement and everything, then we moved on to the war on drugs and mass incarceration and over policing. So what's the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion? I think that a lot of people use these terms interchangeably. I think that a lot of people get them confused. And so I wanted to highlight some of those differences today. So diversity, these are some definitions that I like. There are multiple definitions out there. These definitions come from Extension Foundation Impact Collaborative. And so for diversity, they have diversity is a presence of differences that may include race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, nationality, social economic status, language, disability, age, religious commitment, or political perspective. Now, when we're talking about diversity, a lot of times we're talking about representation, and we're talking about representation in numbers, right? Like oftentimes when people ask about an organization or a company's diversity, they're asking how many BIPOC people are employed there, right? How many people are with BIPOC people are within that organization? And then we have inclusion. Inclusion is an outcome to ensure those that are diverse actually feel and or are welcomed. Inclusion outcomes are met when you, your institution, and your program are truly inviting to all, to the degree to which diverse individuals are able to participate fully in any decision-making processes and development opportunities within an organization or group. So when we're talking about inclusion, a lot of times we're talking about power. So while you might have high diversity within an organization or institution or even a government structure, you might, maybe all of those BIPOC people are administrative staff, right? They're not inclusive in the power. They're not inclusive in the decision-making of that organization. How many BIPOC folks are in the C-suite within that organization, right? And are their voices actually heard to and listened to? So when you're talking about inclusion, you're really looking at power dynamics. Equity. Equity is promoting impartiality and fairness within procedures, processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems. Tackling equity issues requires an understanding of the root cause of outcome disparities within our society. So when we're talking about equity, we're really talking about systems change work, right? So we're not talking about how many BIPOC people are employed within your organization. We're not talking about how many BIPOC people are in your C-suite. We're talking about a process and a goal and how your organization operates. We're talking about changing systems when we're talking about equity, and specifically racial equity. So racial equity as a goal and a process, I like to distinguish between the two. A goal, we had it on our flyer, but basically racial equity is a condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted in a statistical sense how one fares. When we use the term, we're thinking about racial equity as part of racial justice. And though we also include work to address root causes of inequity, not just their manifestations. This includes the elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race or that fail to eliminate them. And so when race is no longer a predictor of one's success or one's outcomes, that's when we've achieved the goal of racial equity. But by process, that is how we get to racial equity. That is how we operationalize racial equity. That's how we advance racial equity. So there are various forms of how people advance racial equity. I'm going to talk about our organization's elements. We have 5 elements to how we think that racial equity can be operationalized as a process. One is we always ground our work in history. You have to know where you've been, how we got here, in order to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself, right? We have to know the root causes of these disparate outcomes, and that is about the history, the racialized history, not only of your jurisdiction or your organization, but also of this country. 2, disaggregated data. We believe that you should disaggregate your data by race and place. When you do this, we believe that this is when you know where and where you can make impact and who will get the most benefit, right? So taken together, the biggest impact, where the intervention should happen and who's going to be benefiting from that intervention. So disaggregated data by race and place is very important. And oftentimes a lot of data is not actually tracked or recorded. Racial equity tools. So tools are really important. I'm going to switch slides and go to racial equity impact assessments. We believe that using tools such as AREIA, AREIA is a racial equity impact assessment. The acronym is REIA. Other types of tools are REAPs, which are racial equity action plans. There are multiple tools out there. Different organizations have their own. The picture right here is the one that our organization developed. And the whole purpose of a racial equity tool is to ensure that you are analyzing like whatever decision you're coming to. So whether it's you're working on legislation, whether or not you're working on a policy for your organization, but whenever a decision is being made, we always advocate that you use a REIA or some form of a tool to make sure that you're analyzing and seeing who's going to benefit and who's going to be burdened by that decision. We believe that there's always somebody that's going to be somebody is going to benefit and somebody is going to be burdened. And when you go through that analysis, if you find at the end of that analysis that Black and Brown communities will be burdened by that decision, then we ask that you go back and redo that decision. So the whole purpose of a tool is just to interject racial analysis in your work. And this goes back to structural racism and the belief that if you are not intentional about like race in analysis and anything that you're doing, then that decision will end up benefiting white folks at the burden of Black and Brown communities and individuals. 4, community leadership. Community leadership is when the most impacted individuals, right, the people that are at the sharpest intersections of the marginalization are at the table developing the solutions too. And so this is basically lived experience. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that term, but we value lived experience as subject matter expertise, right? So these are the people that who might have been homeless at one point, right, or housing insecure. And so they probably have some really good insight on ways that a city or an organization that's trying to tackle issues of housing insecurity could benefit from, right? And so this is why we center and lift up lived experience. We believe that the people at the center of the inequity should be at the table developing and or leading those solutions. Some ways that I value, I feel like most people think of subject matter expertise as like people that studied, right? Like that went and got degrees in a specific subject. While that is very important, we think that partnering subject matter expertise and those traditional definitions of subject matter experts with lived experience, we believe that magic can happen in those moments. Policy and systems change. 5, again, we have a groundwater problem and we need groundwater solutions. And so we really advocate folks to be bold because, I mean, some people have been tackling racial justice and racial equity issues in their entire lives as a country. We know we haven't gotten there. We haven't achieved that goal. And so we ask and we advocate for people to be bold with their solutions and acknowledge that we don't really need programs. We need policy change, right? We need systems change. And if you're not, even systems reform, I'm typically of the mindset that most systems need to be dismantled and rebuilt. But reform can happen too if there is power and a power shift and intentionality and substantive change. Ultimately, racial equity is a lot about resources and shifting resources, right? So we're talking about communities, whole communities that have been divested from, disinvested in this country since its beginning and even before that. And so when we're talking about trying to bring the goal of racial equity, that means that you have to invest, right? You have to shift resources in those communities that have been disinvested in. Another solution that can be use as a policy solution to addressing racial inequity is targeted universalism. This comes from John Powell. I'm gonna play this video. Let's see if it works. That wasn't what I wanted to do. Nope. 1 second. I think the easiest thing for me to do is just play it on the screen.
What is the most effective and sustainable policy response to problems in our society? Universal approaches are widely used in order to package policies for broad appeal. Universal policies such as Social Security and minimum wage provide the same benefits or minimum protections to everyone, regardless of status or group membership. But by treating everyone the same, universal approaches can't root out group-based discrimination. It may actually deepen inequality between groups rather than reduce it. And by providing benefits or protections to everyone, resources that could be targeted to groups worse off instead flow to those who are better off. In contrast to universalism, targeted approaches are commonly used. Targeted policies provide benefits or protections based on group membership or status. SNAP, the food stamp program, conditions benefits on income level. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires public accessibility for disabled groups. And affirmative action focuses on historically disadvantaged groups. Targeted approaches are vulnerable to the critique that they unfairly favor constituent groups over the public good by directing resources to marginalized groups who are already subjected to unfair stereotypes. But universal and targeted approaches are false choices. There is a third way, targeted universalism. Targeted universalism means setting universal goals that can be achieved through targeted approaches. This approach targets the various needs of each group while reminding us that we are all part of the same social fabric. This can be accomplished by following 5 steps. First, set a universal goal. For example, 100% proficiency in 8th grade math. Second, measure how the overall population fares relative to the universal goal. In this example, we might discover that only 80% of 8th graders are proficient in 8th grade math. Third, measure the performance of population segments relative to the universal goal. So although 80% of all 8th graders are proficient, we might find that only 70% of Latinx students are proficient. Fourth, understand how structures and other factors support or impede groups' progress toward the universal goal. For our Latinx students, classroom instruction materials and lessons designed for English speakers may impede learning, including math proficiency. Finally, implement targeted strategies so that each and every group can achieve the universal goal based upon their needs and circumstances. This may take the form of ESL-specific math tutoring for our Latinx students, while another group may require a completely different strategy to achieve the same universal goal. Targeted universalism rejects a blanket universal, which may be indifferent to the reality that different groups are situated differently relative to the institutions and resources of society. By aspiring toward shared universal goals, targeted universalism empowers targeted strategies capable of achieving those goals while moving us beyond concerns over disparities alone and toward our highest aspirations for all.
Great. So now I want to talk about how folks can get involved, what people can do in both individually and then for the collective, right? So one of the main things the first thing I always advocate is for people to become historians. You have to know the racialized history of this country. You absolutely have to live that history. And by live that history, I mean inhale that history, like learn it, be an expert on it, become a subject matter expert on it, because oftentimes people will, or proponents that are against racial equity don't know history, right? And so, and the way that American schools teach history is not accurate, it's very revisionist. And so some books that I absolutely love are Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram Kendi's book. He has two. I push both of them, both Stamped from the Beginning and Stamp, which is actually for young adults, but I really push that for people who are really new to race and policy. Another book is White Rage by Carol Anderson. Another book is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which is all about housing segregation and redlining. What else? There's so many out there, but those are three. Those are three of my favorites. So the next thing you can do is develop an analysis on race. Like people need to, I think that people really need to become subject matter experts in race in this country, right? And so you really just need to develop your analysis on systems. Oftentimes, I feel like one of my favorite abolitionists, Miriam Makaba, said, just because you went to prison doesn't mean you have an analysis of the prison system, right? And so oftentimes people may think they understand systemic racism or structural racism, but they really don't have an analysis. And oftentimes people confuse systemic racism with like interpersonal, everyday bias and implicit bias and microaggressions, which is still racism, but it's not necessarily systemic, right? And so that's what you can do for your own individual self. Then for the collective Black community, you can plug in locally, right? So there are jurisdictions all over the country that are trying to advance racial equity. There's legislation happening all over the country. Here in DC, we passed the REACH Act, which is all about operationalizing racial equity within DC government. Montgomery County passed legislation last year. PG County is trying to work on resolutions. Fairfax County operationalized racial equity through hiring a chief equity officer. And so there are jurisdictions that are really trying to do this work. And so you can plug in and get engaged, civically engaged. If you don't want to necessarily go the government route, then there's sector work, right? So if you're in private sector, then, find out what's going on with, even if you're in private sector and trying to look at it for your organization, by itself. I don't advocate Black folks specifically start being held accountable or trying to tackle racial equity within their organization by themselves, especially if it's outside the scope of your work. I think that people should be paid for that time. Oftentimes organizations look at their Black employees and assume that they'll be able to do, whether it's diversity, inclusion, or equity work, right? And then immediately you're asked to be on some kind of committee and you're for uncompensated labor. I don't believe in that. But there are definitely other ways that you can try to plug in and advocate within, even if you're in the private sector and within your organization. Even if you do that, I advocate that your organization pay you what I like to call a justice bonus for that extra work that is outside the scope of your employment. So I think, Onika, I'm gonna pass the mic to you. Are we opening up for questions?
Sure.
Stop screen sharing now.
Does anyone have any questions? So feel free to write in the chat. I know I have a few questions if you all want to take your time to ask a few or type them out. So the National Bar Association, we're national, but several of us are based here in the DC area. And so we know about DC's REACH Act. Can you speak about that to the extent that you can, and how it's different than what other jurisdictions in the states are doing?
Sorry, say that one more time, Monica.
Oh, let's talk about the REACH Act.
Oh, okay. So the REACH Act was introduced 2019. It's been so long. We've been working on this legislation for a really long time by a DC council member, Kenyon McDuffie. He is a Ward 5 council member here in DC. He is a Black man, and he introduced the REACH Act. And what was unique about the REACH Act is that in working with DC, there's a coalition of organizations that are focused on advancing racial equity in the city. We call it DC Initiative on Racial Equity in Local Government. With the REACH Act, McDuffie worked with the coalition of nonprofits, advocates that advocating for this work, and looked at what other jurisdictions were doing all across the country, right? And so we ended up with this pretty comprehensive legislation, which traditionally, if you look at most jurisdictions, they'll like hire a chief equity officer, right? And then it's like all of the racial equity work is supposed to be housed in this one full FTE, right, which is full-time employment. Like there's one person is about to presto change all of the entire government. Whereas what the REACH Act did, it looked at operationalizing racial equity not only in the executive branch of government, right, not only in our mayor's agencies, but also in the legislative branch, which is our DC Council. And so you have with the legislation the creation of CORE, which is the Council Office on Racial Equity within DC government. And so CORE is in our legislative branch. It has a director, Brian McClure, whose role is to analyze legislation coming out of council, right? So do a RIA, a racial equity impact assessment on legislation. And so in that RIA analysis, it will say whether or not this will be burdensome to Black and brown people in the district or whether or not it will benefit. And so it's the same, the idea of a RIA analysis is the same way that we have when you introduce legislation in DC, you have to do a FIS, which is a fiscal impact assessment, which means that whether or not the district can pay for it, right? Like, can we fund whatever this legislation is? Two, you have to have a LSD, which is a legal sufficiency declaration from the general counsel. Is this legal? What we're doing, is it legal? Where would it fit in the code, right? And then three is to have now we're looking to have this RIA, this racial equity impact assessment on this legislation. What will this legislation do to the will it address inequity in the city, right? Will it not, right? And so right now it's not binding, right? So it's we want it to be binding, it's not there yet, and by that I mean if it will burden Black and brown folks, then that means you can't do the legislation. The same way that like if the city can afford it, you can afford it, right? They don't move forward with it. If it's illegal, they don't move forward with it. Right now they have to do a RIA, but it's not as enforceable as we want it to be. But that is what's happening. The other part of the legislation says that the mayor does have to hire a chief equity officer. And right now that chief equity officer's position will be in our city administrator's office. And their role is to coordinate with other agencies and operationalize racial equity within the agencies. And then these agencies have to do performance reports. They have to do their performance reports through a racial equity lens. The other part of the legislation calls for racial equity training for every DC government employee. And then also the legislation calls for a dashboard, right? By a dashboard, I mean like something, some technology-based website that is tracking inequities in the data. The other part of the other thing that's coming out of the legislation is the appointment of a commission to advise the mayor on racial equity, and then also an advisory council for council to advise council on racial equity. So this is a way that community can get involved. So yeah, most jurisdictions have not done that much work, right? Or have not legislated that far. And a lot of that is due to the advocates and due to the activists that have been pushing this for the past 3 years. And what was unique, or what another thing that's unique is the funding. It's been funded with $5 million. And so that other jurisdictions have not, like I said, a lot of times jurisdictions have just been appointing and hiring one chief equity officer. With the $5 million, you got the core office, which it's not just Brian as a director, he has 3 staff and I think 2 fellows. And then with the chief equity officer, she or he will have staff as well, right? So these are not just one full-time employee with the burden of operationalizing racial equity throughout an entire government. These are offices with staff and capacity. It might not be enough, but it's a start.
Yes. And so as you mentioned, just the legislation itself and the fact that offices have been set up is different than what we see in other jurisdictions, because I know not everyone here is from DC. And as you may have heard Temi mention, DC statehood is a thing. And so the players here are the mayor and the DC council, and that is the parts of DC government that are making all of these moves and where these offices will be housed.
Yes.
We do have a question. How would you handle your organization wanting to partner with the HBCU for employment opportunities and wanting you to organize that program? So someone's organization wants to partner with HBCUs, but I'm assuming is using their
Black employee
to do that work.
Right. I think the first question is whether or not you want to do the work. And, if you want to do it, then you can do it. If you don't want to do it, you can push back. I think the question is, what will happen if you did push back, right? Is it like, were you voluntold that? Like, if you say no, does it impact your employment? And if you do want to do it, I would advocate for you to ask for compensation. 1, I'd advocate for you to ask for compensation. 2, I'd advocate for you to ask for staff and capacity, right? So they're probably not going to hire people for you, but like they can pull on other employees to help you with that capacity and that work and support. And then 3, I would ask for recognition, right? Like you need that recognition for the work that you would be doing. What else? Mainly compensation. I think ask them for that justice bonus. And if it's going to be impeding the roles that the work that you're already doing, then they need to shift some of that workload too. If you want me to do this, you need to make it not like I don't do my job plus this. Like, what are some roles that we're going to pass on? What are some responsibilities we're going to pass on to enable me to be able to do this work?
Thank you. I do have another question. Can you speak to HR 40? I know that there were hearings last week, to the extent that you can, and just explain like what it is, why it's important, why people should care.
Mm-hmm. So HR 40 is about a commission on developing or the formation of a commission to study reparations and what that could look like. And again, this is not to pay reparations. This is not to even say what reparations are. This is for the commission of a study, right? For a commission to study what reparations could look like. And so there was a hearing, I believe it was 2 summers ago. 2020 makes my time run crazy. Yeah. Right. So it was, we were all, the outside was open. So I think it was 2019. I think it was the summer of 2019. And then this past, was it Tuesday? Last week, we had the hearing again virtually. And, I thought it was a good hearing. The Republicans got witnesses, there were Democrats and Republican witnesses, and all of the Republican witnesses were Black men saying that we didn't need reparations. And it was interesting because that wasn't the question. The question was whether or not we should form a commission to study what reparations could look like. Mm-hmm. And I won't go into my colorful language around these people, but I do advocate people to watch that hearing. I think it's important to hear all the arguments.
Thank you. And we're nonpartisan, so we're just talking about what occurred.
Yes.
I'm trying to just making sure I didn't miss anything. Please let us know. You can also raise your hand if you prefer to speak. We can allow you to speak as well. Well, I'm not seeing any more comments. So, any final words, Temi, that you would like to add?
I want to share an example of lived experience, right? And so partnering with lived experience. And so like as a foundation, so I work at Consumer Health Foundation. We talked about that, but Consumer Health Foundation is a private foundation. So what that means is that we are privately endowed. We don't fundraise. Our money is in the markets, and that's how we generate revenue, right? And in order to fund the work that we fund. And that's how traditional foundations are. Like they don't fundraise. It comes like there's a pocket of wealth, some kind of endowment that is most of the time in markets. And so a few years ago, this was like summer of 2018, Consumer Health Foundation as an organization, we talked about how we really wanted to be community centered, right? And have developed relationships with community members ourselves and people with lived experience who are living like these inequities that we say that we are trying to address. And so traditionally you have philanthropy, and then you have the nonprofits, and then you have the nonprofits serving the community, right? That's kind of how the funding cycle goes. So like foundations give money and grants to nonprofits. Nonprofits serve the community, and it can be direct services or it can be through advocacy, however those nonprofits are serving those communities. And so us trying to build our own relationship with the community and also pull back the veil from what philanthropy is and the racialized even history of philanthropy, right? And so we had what we called a series called Foundation Learning Days, where on a Saturday, people could come and learn about philanthropy. What is it? What is a foundation, right? And then also what is a board of trustees, right? And like how roles, like, you know, what are the roles, what are the fiduciary duties of board members, and like trying to create and build capacity of people understanding around philanthropy, and then actually provide opportunities. And so we ended up recruiting from the group of people that participated in our Foundation Learning Days to we have 5 new board members from the community serving on our board, directing and partnering with us, right, as a staff on addressing these inequities. And so we think that that lived experience is really important. So anyway, there was a woman named Venoriko who participated in our Foundation Learning Days. And so we've had this relationship with her since then. And during the pandemic, she lost her job, and a lot of people have lost their job. And so she's a part of an organization of restaurant workers in the city. And so she asked, they did a fundraiser, and they had a pot of money, and she came to CHF and asked, could we take this pot of money and put it in the markets, right? And help generate more revenue for them, right? And we went to one of our board members who has expertise in financial markets, and he said, how about this? Instead of in addition, like we can do a double impact by taking the money and doing a PRI. And with the PRI, and by PRI I mean a private it's a, what is it? PRI. It's when foundations take a portion of their endowment and loan it out to like a business, right? To so say if it's not a nonprofit, we're not funding it, but to a for-profit business that is or purpose is to advance racial equity or racial justice, right? It could be training, it could be an incubator type of business, it could be whatever it is, but it's for profit. We are giving them a very low interest loan, so a favorable loan for them to advance that work. That is another way that people can be mission aligned in their funding as a foundation. And so that's what we're doing. So we're creating what we ended up turning this idea into is a UBI project, right? So investing the money into a loan that would generate interest, and with that interest, pay that interest to the members of her group, where they would be getting, and hopefully it'd be enough to be a living wage or universal income. Universal basic income.
Mhm.
So this is our current, but that was, a community member coming to us with an idea, right? And then shaping it into something that we're really excited about, this UBI pilot project that we are kicking off this year.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just making sure we didn't get any other questions. So before we go, we have an event every night this week, but tomorrow we have an event called Queer History is Black History, a conversation with George M. Johnson. Their book, All Boys Aren't Blue, is a bestseller, and our very own Preston Mitchum will be interviewing George. So please come out for that. If you're interested in learning more about the NBA YLD, we also have an event on Wednesday with one of our vice presidents, Lamont Bailey, where he'll talk about his rise through YLD NBA leadership into being a vice president. We have an event on Thursday with our professional development committee. And on Friday, we actually have an event with our past president, Ben Crump, speaking about his book. So please follow us on social media, on Instagram, which is probably how you all got here. It's NBA_YLD. And thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you. Have a great night.
Good night.